October 5, 2027. Dozens of ZBD-05 amphibious assault vehicles of the People's Liberation Army reach the beaches near Linkou. Their mission is clear: break through Taiwan's first defensive line and secure a foothold for the thousands of troops expected to land in the following hours. But as soon as the ZBDs roll onto the sand, Taiwanese defenders open fire from hidden positions inland. One vehicle is struck by a Kestrel anti-tank missile and bursts into flames. And thus begins China's campaign to annex Taiwan. What would a Chinese invasion of Taiwan actually look like? And more importantly, could Taiwan and the United States repel such an assault? Let's find out. In the past few years, it feels like the world has started moving faster than ever. Events that once took decades now unfold in weeks, and a single political shift, new technology, or regional crisis can reshape entire markets. In such times, understanding how global changes translate into economic reality becomes more important than ever. That is why I use XTB, an investment app that helps me follow and interpret those shifts through the lens of global markets. It has become my everyday tool for managing investments and tracking world trends. With access to over 8,400 stocks and ETFs and commission-free investing up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover, it lets me act when new opportunities emerge, not after they have already passed. The link is in the description, and by using it you support our channel. Remember that investing always involves risk. The year is 2027. The geopolitical situation remains tense and unstable. The war in Ukraine has entered its fifth year. After failed peace talks with Vladimir Putin, President Donald Trump distances himself from the conflict. The US continues to supply weapons to Kyiv, but European allies now bear most of the costs. Since adopting a new national defense strategy in late 2025, America has drifted toward a more isolationist posture, redirecting part of its forces to operations against drug cartels on the Mexican border and in the Caribbean. This shift unsettles US allies in the Indo-Pacific, who fear weakening security guarantees amid rising Chinese pressure. In this atmosphere, a close meeting of the Central Military Commission takes place in Beijing in April 2027, one that will soon push the world toward global conflict. During the session, Xi Jinping concludes that conditions are favorable for resolving the quote, Taiwan question. His calculation rests on several factors. Since 2021, China's economy has slowed, and the Communist Party's legitimacy depends increasingly on nationalism rather than growth. Reunification with Taiwan, portrayed as the culmination of the country's great rejuvenation, becomes central to securing Xi's legacy and consolidating his rule. The year 2027 carries powerful symbolism, marking the centennial of the People's Liberation Army, PLA, and a key milestone in its modernization. PLA commanders believe they finally reached the level of capability required to take the enormous risk of invading Taiwan. Their confidence aligns with assessments from US defense analysts who refer to the so-called Davidson window. According to this theory, after 2027, the military balance in the Taiwan Strait will tilt so decisively toward China that any US intervention would become prohibitively costly, and under certain conditions, perhaps impossible. At the same time, China's demographic problems are not yet severe enough to constrain large-scale military ambitions. In this context, a fateful decision is made. The invasion will take place in October, when weather conditions across the Taiwan Strait are the most favorable. What follows is a 6-month period of covert mobilization. Beijing's main challenge is to assemble invasion forces without alerting Taiwan or its allies. Following the Russian playbook before Ukraine, the PLA disguises its build-up as routine activity. In May 2027, the Eastern Theater Command launches large, quote, Defender of the Nation drills, ostensibly reacting to separatist provocations. The exercises normalize a heavy military presence in Fujian and around Taiwan. At the same time, under the guise of modernization or disaster relief, stockpiles of ammunition, fuel and supplies quietly appear along the coast. US and Taiwanese intelligence spot the buildup, but can't tell whether it's a show of strength or preparation for invasion. Confusion grows when the PLA avoids concentrating amphibious ships in military ports. Instead, it relies on civilian ro-ro ferries, a key part of its military-civil fusion strategy. These ships provide enormous lift capacity, roughly 2.4 million tons compared to the PLA Navy's 370,000, but are unarmored and easy targets. To maintain secrecy, they continue commercial operations, with mobilization ordered just 72 hours before the assault. The PLA's choice of autumn landing is no accident. Weather in the Taiwan Strait allows large-scale amphibious operations only twice a year, in spring, April-May, and autumn, late September-October. Outside these windows, conditions are brutal. From June to early September, typhoon season brings destructive winds and high seas, while from November to March, powerful northeast monsoons dominate. Every side knows this, so when Beijing extends its Defender of the Nation drills through October, US intelligence no longer doubts its intentions. China is going for Taiwan. Detecting the invasion plan proves crucial. It gives Taipei and Washington time to mobilize. In this scenario, on September 15th, the CIA places a classified report on Donald Trump's desk. He alerts Taiwan's president that the assault will begin in early October. Preparations for defense begin immediately. Taiwan's defense ministry quietly raises the alert level, cancels leave for key personnel, and extends the Han Kuang exercises through November, adding an unprecedented call-up of reservists. The ROC military disperses its most valuable assets. Fighter jets move into fortified underground hangars, like Jiashen and Sijishen, while major naval units leave crowded ports at Zuoying and Suwao to regroup at sea. Engineers begin preemptively mining approaches to key harbors and beaches. The United States also moves into action. Despite his isolationist posture, Trump adopts a hawkish stance, seeing the war over Taiwan as a struggle for the future of American power. Losing the island would shatter the first island chain, the line from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines that contains China's navy, giving Beijing direct access to the Pacific and threatening US territories like Guam and allies including Japan and the Philippines. The stakes are also economic. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors, and more than 90% of the most advanced ones. If it falls, China gains control over the industry, a tool of economic coercion on a global scale. Furthermore, inaction over Taiwan would shatter US credibility, and no American president, least of Donald Trump, wants to be remembered as the one who lost the Pacific to China. In response, Trump orders the US armed forces to take all necessary steps to defend Taiwan from Chinese aggression. Indo-PACOM ramps up reconnaissance flights over the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, while additional military assets are rushed to the Pacific. Squadrons of F-22 Raptors and F-35s arrive at US airbases in Japan, and long-range B-1 Lancer, B-52 Stratofortress, and B-2 Spirit bombers are deployed to Guam. At the same time, US commanders face a strategic dilemma: how to position their most valuable assets, the carrier strike groups, without exposing them to the full reach of China's expanding missile arsenal. Pushing US carriers close to Taiwan would send a powerful signal of resolve, but at enormous risk. War games run by CSIS and others consistently show that carriers operating too near the Chinese coast are destroyed within the first days of the conflict. by concentrated PLA ballistic missile strikes. In the CSIS baseline scenario, 2 carriers are lost. After urgent consultations with Indo-PACOM, President Trump opts for a more cautious approach. Deterrence has failed, and preserving key assets for a long war becomes the top priority. The USS George Washington and USS Ronald Reagan carrier strike groups take up positions in the Philippine Sea, east of the first island chain, outside the range of most Chinese missiles. This decision fundamentally changes the role. Rather than leading the opening blows, the carriers become a reserve force, to be committed only once submarines and long-range bombers have begun eroding China's anti-access bubble. Political maneuvering becomes just as critical as military operations. On September 25th, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrives in Tokyo, unannounced. For 2 days, he meets with Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi to negotiate the use of US military bases in Japan for Taiwan's defense, a decision that could determine the outcome of the entire war. War games show that defending Taiwan is operationally impossible without access to these bases. Installations like Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, just 600 kilometers from Taiwan, serve as quote unsinkable aircraft carriers, allowing US jets to conduct multiple sorties per day. Without them, American aircraft would have to fly from Guam, 2,700 kilometers away, or even Hawaii, turning each mission into a logistical nightmare that would drastically cut sortie rates. However, under the 1960 US-Japan Security Treaty, Washington must obtain Tokyo's consent before using these bases for missions unrelated to Japan's direct defense. The Japanese government thus faces a grave choice: support the US and risk Chinese retaliation, potentially even nuclear, or refuse and jeopardize the alliance, effectively postponing an inevitable confrontation with Beijing. Despite mounting Chinese threats, Prime Minister Takaichi stands firm. She grants the US states permission to use Japanese bases, but stops short of authorizing direct involvement of Japan self-defense forces unless China attacks Japanese territory first. Tokyo therefore chooses option B, cooperation without direct engagement. By late September, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, has reached full readiness for an invasion of Taiwan. Yet Beijing still lacks one crucial element: a casus belli, a trigger it can use to justify the assault, so it decides to create one. On September 30th, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, under the pretext of a routine inspection, attempts to board a Taiwanese civilian ferry near the Kinmen Islands. A Taiwanese Coast Guard cutter rushes to intervene. The encounter escalates into a brief but deadly exchange of fire. In the chaos, 2 Chinese officers are killed. Within minutes, Chinese state media amplify the incident, framing it as an unprovoked act of Taiwanese aggression. Tensions skyrocket. President Trump, true to form, issues a fiery warning to Xi Jinping, vowing serious consequences if China dares to escalate. But Beijing presses forward. The PLA declares a maritime blockade around the Kinmen and Matsu Islands, and issues an ultimatum to Taipei: hand over those responsible within 5 days, or face decisive action. Taiwan rejects the ultimatum. On October 2nd, the Central Military Commission convenes in Beijing to approve the final invasion plan. Alongside the operation against Taiwan, the leadership debates a critical question: how to handle the growing US and the Japanese military presence. Chinese intelligence has confirmed a surge of American air power in bases across Japan, forcing the Politburo to weigh 3 dangerous choices. If Beijing ignores these developments, option A, and the US enters the war, American aircraft could decimate China's invasion fleet within days. A preemptive strike, option B, on US bases in Japan and Guam could cripple American air power before it takes off, securing China's beachheads on Taiwan. But it would also guarantee full-scale war with both the US and Japan. a staggering escalation that Beijing might nonetheless accept if it believes Taiwan could be subdued before Washington recovers from the initial blow. Finally, a delayed strike, option C, attacking only Taiwan first and hitting US bases later if Washington intervenes, offers more control over escalation, yet it carries a serious flaw. Once US aircraft disperse into the air or to alternate bases, a later strike could cause far fewer losses. Wargames highlight the stakes. Roughly 90% of all US aircraft losses in simulated conflicts with China occur on the ground, destroyed before takeoff, a result of limited hardened shelters across the Pacific. Faced with this calculus, Xi Jinping chooses the riskiest but potentially most decisive course. On day one, China will strike not only Taiwan, but also US bases in Japan and Guam. At 2 o'clock local time on October 5th, the PLA launches hostilities. The Chinese move fast and with overwhelming force. The aim is not gradual escalation, but a rapid, paralyzing blow designed to break Taiwan's defenders and deter their allies. PLA rocket forces begin a massive strike campaign against Taiwanese targets. The attack is layered and reflects lessons learned from Russia's early problems suppressing Ukrainian air defenses in 2022. From the first salvo, the Chinese deploy swarms, thousands of cheap drones to confuse defenders and help penetrate Taiwan's air defense network. Hundreds of ballistic and cruise missiles slam into air bases at Hsinchu, Taoyuan, Qingchuankang, and Chiayi. Naval ports at Cuoying and Suao, key early warning radar sites, including the strategically important PAVE pause on Mount Leshan, C4 ISR nodes, and government building in Taipei. Simultaneously, heavy strikes hit forward bastions, the Pescadores and Kinmen archipelagos. Despite prior dispersal measures, Taiwan suffers grievous losses. Wargames by CSIS suggest Taiwan loses the bulk of its air force and surface fleet in the opening phase. Several factors explain this. First, scale. Taiwan has a limited number of hardened shelters, and it is logistically impossible to keep every unit safely dispersed indefinitely. Second, Chinese strategy emphasizes crippling the infrastructure that enables aircraft and ships to operate, rather than destroying every platform outright. Surviving planes are effectively trapped in shelters when runways and taxiways are cratered. Ships that sortie cannot return to bombarded ports for fuel and munitions. Neutralizing the opponent therefore requires taking away his ability to fight, not annihilating each asset. The few relatively secure bases are the underground hubs at Jiashen and Sijishen, which can shelter some 75 to 200 aircraft, but repairing the runways would take at least 2 weeks if attacks continue. Kinetic strikes on ROC bases are accompanied by a massive cyber and electronic campaign. PLA space and information support forces attempt to blind Taiwan's early warning systems through jamming and cyber attacks on satellites and by severing undersea fiber optic cables. Immediately after the initial missile barrage, the PLA Navy and Air Force begin operations to seize full control of the Taiwan Strait and establish a tight anti-access area denial zone. Chinese warships move into positions in the Philippine Sea east of Taiwan, forming a defensive cordon meant to intercept and engage any approaching US naval forces, particularly carrier strike groups. Meanwhile, PLA rocket and air forces continue relentless strikes to neutralize Taiwan's remaining ability to threaten the invasion fleet, haunting mobile anti-ship missile launchers and surviving air defense batteries. Under the Central Military Commission's directive, Taiwan is not the only target of the war's opening salvo. The PLA simultaneously launches preemptive strikes on US bases in Japan and on Guam. In Japan, the attacks concentrate on key air bases: Kadena, Misawa, Iwakuni, and Yokota. Short-range ballistic missiles such as DF-15 and DF-16, many carrying cluster warheads, rain down on runways and tarmacs, destroying dozens of parked American aircraft. The losses are catastrophic, a direct result of the limited number of hardened aircraft shelters, which makes US air power in the region highly vulnerable to massed missile strikes. The scale of the problem is stark. Over the past decade, the United States has built only 2 hardened shelters within 1,000 nautical miles of Taiwan. The PLA also strikes Guam, the main hub for US strategic bombers. For the attack on Andersen Air Force Base, the PLA employs medium-range ballistic DF-26 missiles, the so-called Guam Killer. Targets include runways, fuel depots, command nodes, and above all, the hard stands that shelter B-1B, B-52, and the B-2 bombers. Losses to the US Air Force there are severe. Guam has no hardened aircraft shelters. Using CSIS data as a baseline, we estimate a preemptive PLA strike could be devastating, destroying the majority of aircraft on the ground. If strikes on airfields persist over subsequent days, up to 90% of aircraft could be lost on parking ramps. Cumulatively, that would mean US losses on the order of 400 aircraft, and roughly 140 for Japan across the conflict. After the initial paralyzing blows, the PLA moves to the operation's decisive phase, moving invasion forces across the Taiwan Strait and securing a beachhead. Beijing faces a tactical choice: land directly on Taiwan or seize the pescadores first, an option often overlooked. The pescadores sit just 50 kilometers from Taiwan and historically have been pivotal in any large-scale assault. Capturing them would give the PLA a secure staging area and remove a direct threat to the invasion fleet. But the ROC garrison there, roughly 5,000 troops, backed by artillery, rockets and fortifications, would be costly to dislodge. Protracted fighting on the islands would delay the main landings. For that reason, the PLA opts not to mount a full assault on the pescadores, instead planning to suppress the garrison with concentrated missile and airstrikes. That is only one of several operation dilemmas confronting PLA command. Taiwan's geography sharply constrains viable landing zones. The east coast is sheer cliffs, so large-scale landings are possible only from the west. And even there, only a dozen or so beaches have the right depth and inland routes. Behind those beaches, the terrain quickly narrows into predictable defensive corridors: rivers, towns, narrow plains, and mountains that channel any attacker. The south offers easier offloading and access to the port of Kaohsiung, but it lies roughly 300 kilometers from Taipei, across densely urbanized terrain, so any advance quickly loses momentum. The north gives a chance for a rapid strike at the capital, but about 46% of ROC forces are concentrated there, which makes a northern landing exceptionally risky. War games have generally favored a southern landing, yet if Beijing wants to force the Americans to face a fait accompli, it will gamble on the north. In our scenario, the PLA assigns roughly 80% of its assault forces northwards, keeping the remainder for supporting and diversionary operations. Chinese Amphibious doctrine calls for a three-dimensional landing that combines airborne, helicopter-borne assault and seaborne landings. The cross-strait lift begins almost simultaneously with the opening rocket strikes. At 4 o'clock, hundreds of assault helicopters from PLA air assault brigades cross the strait at low altitude. Their objectives are to seize littoral roads, neutralize coastal artillery, and secure the approaches to the landing beaches, and above all to capture Taipei port, which is essential to offload heavy equipment from civilian ro-ro ferries. Simultaneously, transport aircraft drop paratroopers from the Airborne Corps. Their highest value objective is Taoyuan International Airport, on Taipei's outskirts. Seizing Taoyuan, analogous to Hostomel during the early phase of Russia's 2022 invasion, would allow a rapid air bridge for heavy equipment and follow-on waves directly into the capital. But this phase is extremely perilous. Paratroopers are lightly equipped and can be destroyed if not reinforced quickly by heavy forces. Success, therefore, hinges on flawless synchronization across the entire invasion. At around 5 o'clock, dawn brings the first wave of amphibious assaults to the beaches at Linku, northwest of Taipei, and near Xinwu. The PLA Marine Corps, using amphibious IFVs and hovercraft, aims to break the initial defensive line and secure beachheads. The objective is a rapid junction with airborne units at Taoyuan and then a push toward Taipei. The first wave numbers several thousand troops and a few hundred amphibious vehicles. Simultaneously, a smaller landing, likely 1 or 2 amphibious brigades, hits the Taichung area to seize Taiwan's second largest port and the Qinchuankang airbase. Success here would pin down the 10th Army Corps, central Taiwan, and sever the island, hindering south to north reinforcement. In addition, limited raids by PLA special forces are being conducted in the Yilan area. Their aim is not to capture territory, but to block key tunnels and roads, Highway number 5, leading from the Yilan Plain to Taipei, in order to delay the arrival of Taiwanese reinforcements from the eastern part of the island to the capital. As the invasion fleet nears, ROC forces strike the landing ships. Mobile coastal missiles such as the Xiaofeng 2 and 3 prove lethal to surface ships, especially unarmored ro-ro ferries. Some invasion vessels are sunk before reaching shore, yet the assault fleet is large enough that PLA troops still manage to land. Under heavy ROC missile fire, a portion of the invasion fleet is destroyed before reaching Taiwan's shores. Yet the armada is vast, and despite the losses, PLA troops still make landfall. But reaching the beach offers no safety. It is where the real battle begins. From well-camouflaged defensive positions inland, ROC artillery, mortars, and anti-tank missiles unleash devastating fire. Within minutes, the beaches of Linku and Xinwu turn into killing grounds. The PLA, however, has planned for such resistance. Drones become the key to breaking the deadlock. Swarms of reconnaissance and FPV strike drones launch from amphibious ships and support barges, blanketing the coast. They provide unmatched situational awareness and precision firepower, spotting hidden Taiwanese units and directing counterfire. Despite heavy casualties, the first assault wave manages to breach the defensive line. By evening, PLA forces have secured footholds near Linku and Taichung, while an air assault brigade successfully captures Taipei port. Good news also arrives from Taoyuan Airport, where PLA airborne troops seize the terminal and reopen damaged runways, potentially creating an air bridge for reinforcements. But not everything goes according to the plan. Special forces attempting a daring river assault up the Tamsui River, aiming to penetrate central Taipei and decapitate Taiwan's leadership, encounter fierce resistance. ROC troops have mined the river and set up barriers. The Chinese commandos are caught in a deadly trap. Suffering up to 80% losses, the survivors retreat in disarray. For now, Taiwan's political leadership remains intact and defiant. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs report strikes on US bases in Japan and on Guam. The president immediately authorizes the use of force, asks Congress for a formal declaration of war, and delivers a hardline, choosing an instant, resolute response. Around Taiwan, US nuclear attack submarines, Virginia and Los Angeles classes that had been prepositioned now begin hunting the Chinese invasion fleet in the strait. Operating covertly, they are among the most effective tools against unarmored transports. CSIS wargames suggest a single SSN can sink about 2 large landing ships and 2 escorts in 3.5 days. A squadron, 4 boats, could put some 16 ships out of action in the same span, sharply slowing reinforcements. The hunt, however, is risky. Chinese corvettes, patrol aircraft and submarines actively counterattack, and straight approaches may be mined. CSIS estimates US submarine losses could run around 20% every 3.5 days in the conflict's opening phase. SSN availability is also limited. Some hulls must shadow Chinese strategic units, so American subs operate in cycles. Hunt, return to Guam or Yokosuka to replenish, then sortie again, which hampers sustained pressure. Japanese submarines join in, covering other sectors to avoid fratricide and striking escorts and ships leaving port. US air power, the survivors in theater, plus aircraft flying in from Hawaii and the mainland intensified strikes on the invasion convoys. Long-range anti-ship missiles, AGM-158C LRASM, carried by, among others, 1Bs and FA-18s, play a key role. They can hit the armada from a safe standoff, but stocks are limited, forcing hard tactical choices. LRASM is the optimal weapon for destroying China's maritime transport, but at current production and stock trends, the United States will have only about 450 LRASMs in October 2027. Optimistic estimate is 600. That is enough to inflict serious logistical pain on Beijing, but not to break the invasion. By contrast, the US inventory includes roughly 6,000 JASM-ER missiles, yet these missiles are not currently configured for maritime strike. Modifications are underway, but for now they are used mainly against ports and logistics hubs. For the purposes of this scenario, we assume JASM-ER proves ineffective against naval targets. The carriers USS George Washington and USS Ronald Reagan, pre-positioned in the Philippine Sea, act as a strategic reserve. Their FA-18s wait until submarines and long-range bombers have degraded China's anti-access bubble. They would only enter the fight once LRASM stocks are expanded, and shorter-range weapons must be used. A move that forces US forces closer to the fight. That posture minimizes the risk of losing a carrier, but weakens immediate striking power. And after the strikes on bases in Japan and Guam, Washington can ill afford carrier losses. On day 2, the PLA commits a second wave to shore, consolidating forces ashore. Units from the Linku beachhead push east to link up with paratroopers at Taoyuan, and the first heavy armored clashes erupt with counterattacking elements of Taiwan's 542nd Armored Brigade. Despite fierce resistance, by evening Chinese forces have established an extended lodgment from Linkou to Taoyuan Airport, continuously reinforced from the mainland. By this stage, the beachhead may hold roughly 12,000 PLA troops. The CSIS wargame found the PLA could land roughly 8,000 troops on D-Day, and about 16,000 within the first 3.5 days, one turn in their model. In our scenario, we assume slightly more optimistic conditions for Beijing, so marginally higher numbers make it ashore. But there is a catch, a classic logistical paradox. Each additional soldier ashore means they need more ammunition, fuel and food, which quickly cannibalizes lift and sustainment capacity that might otherwise deliver yet more troops. In response, Taiwan's 6th Corps orders intense strikes on Taipei's port and the Taoyuan runways. Damaging runways and harbor infrastructure slows the flow of PLA reinforcements and material, buying ROC time to contest the lodgment. Meanwhile, the Taichung lodgment grows, worrying Taipei Command. If it holds, it threatens the Central Island communications axis. The 10th Army Corps is ordered to eliminate the beachhead as fast as possible. The first week devolves into grinding, bitter fighting ashore. ROC units counterattack relentlessly wherever opportunity presents itself, trying to drive invaders back into the sea. Allied strikes relentlessly target the invasion fleet to collapse Beijing's logistics. Without resupply, the lodgements cannot be sustained. LRASM rounds exact a heavy toll, but the Allied stockpile of roughly 450 LRASMs is exhausted within that first week. The maritime campaign is thus forced to shift onto the far larger inventory of AGM-158B JASM-ERs, weapons not optimized from anti-ship missions. That mismatch produces a cascade of tactical problems for US planners. First, the invasion fleet becomes less vulnerable to long-range standoff strikes. To keep hitting maritime targets, US Air Forces must employ shorter-range munitions, JSMs, JSOW glide bombs, and the like, which requires aircraft to operate closer to the fight. Second, the operational squeeze compels low observable fighters, F-35s and F-22s, to operate contested airspace inside the envelope of China's layered air defense systems and PLA fighter patrols. The result is more frequent, higher-intensity air engagements and dangerous close-in confrontations with shipboard air defense systems, conditions that markedly increase Allied aircraft losses. Air combat remains brutal and attritional. PLA aviation, operating from intact mainland bases, enjoys structural advantages, far shorter transit times, higher sortie rates, and rapid rotation. By contrast, US and Japanese forces, though technically superior and better trained, are hamstrung by damaged and degraded basing, fractured logistics, and the ongoing threat of follow-on missile strikes. That constrains sortie generation and imposes a persistent operational handicap. Beijing's priority is to maintain continuous combat air patrols over the Taiwan Strait, to shield the invasion fleet and provide close air support to land forces. Allied commanders thus face a wrenching choice: contest Chinese air superiority directly over Taiwan, accepting very high attrition, or try to skirt PLA patrols to strike transports from less contested corridors. In practice, they blend those options. F-22s attempt to carve temporary corridors so F-35s and FA-18s can reach the ships with strike packages. Those efforts yield only intermittent, local advantages rather than a durable regional edge. As the war enters its second week, the strategic picture looks as follows. American power has been humiliated by Chinese strikes on bases in Japan and Guam. China has lost around 30% of its transport fleet, yet still manages to resupply its beachheads. Meanwhile, the US stockpile of LRASM missiles has been depleted. On the island itself, around 30,000 PLA troops are now deployed. And yet, despite these seemingly favorable developments for China, the PLA High Command cannot be fully satisfied. The situation on the ground is turning increasingly dangerous. Taiwan's forces have recovered from the initial shock of the successful northern landings. With every passing day and every square kilometer, the ROC's defenses grow stronger. Urban warfare has become the biggest challenge for the PLA, as Taiwanese troops turn city districts into fortresses. To make matters worse, ROC artillery continues to shell the captured ports of Taipei and Taichung, as well as the runways at Taoyuan. Docks and airstrips are constantly cratered and damaged. Although Chinese engineers managed to carry out repairs, the supply flow reaching the beachheads remains highly irregular and insufficient. The PLA's top command now forces growing political pressure. A week into the campaign, Xi Jinping's promise of a quick victory has not materialized. Although the landing succeeded, the PLA holds only two small and vulnerable footholds near Taipei and Taichung. With mounting losses and rising frustration in Beijing, Xi demands a swift resolution to the conflict. In response, the PLA's High Command orders a major offensive, a westward assault on Taiwan's capital. Meanwhile, the Americans face another strategic dilemma. Although attacks on Chinese logistics are having an effect, the exhaustion of LRASM stocks has slowed the campaign to strangle the beachheads more than expected. From Washington's perspective, there may be a strong temptation to take the fight onto the Chinese mainland, to strike targets in eastern provinces. There are psychological drivers for such a course: the humiliation of the strikes on US bases in Japan and Guam, and, in our scenario, the temperament of President Trump, who demands retribution for the quote, Pearl Harbor of our times. The US also has roughly 6,000 JASSM-ER missiles in its depots. While those weapons aren't designed for maritime targets, they are well suited to hitting air bases, ports and other continental infrastructure that support the invasion. But there are serious limits. Eastern China contains large numbers of hardened aircraft shelters, which means strikes would likely focus on runways and aviation logistics rather than simply destroying Chinese aircraft in place. As a result, the effects of strikes on the mainland would probably be transient, especially since China could respond by operating aircraft from interior bases. Striking the mainland is also politically and operationally risky. US planners view attacks on China itself as an escalation step close to all-out war, even nuclear war. In our scenario, the deciding factor is the president's temperament. Driven by a demand for revenge, the Pearl Harbor of our time, the United States opts for a limited mainland campaign. JASSM-ERs and Tomahawks are used to strike only the invasion-related military infrastructure. Selected port quays used for troop embarkation. Runways and taxiways at air bases launching strikes on Taiwan. And forward and ammunition fuel dumps supporting the invasion. Deliberately avoided are higher-level command centers, civilian infrastructure, and any targets that would be widely seen as strategic and likely to trigger a drastic response from Beijing. The aim is revenge on Beijing, to slow China's logistics and blunt the pace of PLA reinforcements to Taiwan, while keeping the political and strategic escalation to a minimum. The immediate effect is a short-lived breathing space for Taiwan. Flows of ammunition and fuel to the beachheads drop, but the overall military pressure continues. This option lowers the chance of an immediate slide into nuclear war, though it does not eliminate that risk entirely. Because of China's many hardened aircraft shelters and the ability to operate aircraft from the interior bases, losses to the Chinese Air Force will not be decisive, while runways and taxiways in the eastern provinces are being repaired. The more severe impact falls on China's invasion fleet. Strikes on ports, especially Xiamen, Guangzhou and Fuzhou, destroy some ro-ro ferries and landing ships while they are loading. Reduced port throughput forces the PLA to use smaller harbors and improvised landing sites, increasing logistical chaos and lengthening transport rotation times across the strait. Shocked by the US strikes, Beijing elevates the readiness of its nuclear forces and threatens counterattacks on the US mainland. In the end, Xi Jinping avoids direct strategic escalation and orders intensified strikes on US bases in Japan and on Guam. Attacks that, because of insufficient hardened shelters there, inflict serious pain on American forces. The events of the second and third weeks of fighting for Taiwan make one thing clear. Logistics is the queen of war. Allied attacks on China's transport fleet and mainland ports have pushed cumulative Chinese naval losses to around 60%, a critical threshold. Beyond this point, the invasion force begins to feel the strain of supply shortages. The PLA is no longer rotating fresh troops across the strait. It is focused solely on resupplying those already on the island. Roughly 50,000 Chinese soldiers are now fighting on Taiwan, facing up to 200,000 Taiwanese troops in the field, with the potential mobilization of 2 million reservists still ahead. On land, the tide is also turning against China. The PLA's offensive toward Taipei has stalled. Although Chinese troops managed to seize parts of New Taipei City and push to within 2 kilometers of the government district, the advance was eventually halted. At one point, the situation was so dire that ROC commanders ordered the bridges over the Tamsui River to be mined. Ultimately, however, the PLA's offensive ground to a halt amid fierce resistance and worsening logistical chaos in the dense urban terrain. A similar story unfolds around Taichung, where the PLA captured the local port and parts of the city's western districts, only to once again lose the battle to supply lines and city streets. After a month of fighting, the conflict reaches a turning point. The stalemate on land and growing supply problems force the PLA to switch to the defensive and consolidate what it has captured. If the current dynamics persist, the PLA will not only fail to take Taiwan, it stands to lose the very bridgeheads it fought so hard to secure. The toll is catastrophic for all sides. The PLA has lost roughly 17,000 troops in ground combat and another 15,000 at sea, along with much of its invasion fleet. More than 100 large ships and ro-ro vessels and over 150 aircraft. The United States has suffered about 4,000 killed, but nearly 450 aircraft, 14 large surface combatants, and 4 submarines were lost. Allied Japan lost 2,500 personnel, 150 aircraft, 14 large warships, and 1 submarine. Taiwan has borne the heaviest cost, roughly 20,000 troops lost, almost its entire surface fleet, and most of its combat air force. Only aircraft that happened to be sheltered at Chiashen and Sisishen survived. Crucially, after China's strike on Guam and the US retaliatory attacks on the Chinese mainland, the war has spilled beyond a Taiwan conflict. It is now a direct US-China confrontation, with a rising risk of tipping into nuclear war. In this charged atmosphere, Beijing and Washington face stark choices. Beijing could sue for peace and withdraw its forces from Taiwan, a move that would likely end Xi Jinping's rule and throw the PRC into internal chaos. Alternatively, Beijing might escalate further, for example by using tactical nuclear strikes against Taiwan. Such a decision would prompt the US to respond in kind with tactical nuclear strikes on Chinese footholds in Taiwan, risking an uncontrolled spiral of nuclear escalation. Regardless of what China decides, the United States, though winning the war of attrition, may also consider escalation. Hawks in Washington could push to expand the conflict with deeper strikes on the Chinese mainland, seeing in it a chance to topple the government of the People's Republic. Yet such a move would once again bring the world to the brink of nuclear confrontation. And so our scenario ends in a state of strategic stalemate. The Chinese invasion continues, while the Americans methodically destroy PLA warships and aircraft, providing steady support to Taiwan's defenders on the ground. At sea, the US Navy enforces a distant blockade. The Malacca, Sunda, and the Indonesian and Philippine Straits are all closed to Chinese shipping. While China still holds enough stockpiles to fight for months and maintains overland access through Russia, the maritime blockade strikes at the very heart of its economy. As a result, the long-term outlook for China's amphibious campaign grows increasingly bleak. So what strategic lessons can we draw from this scenario? First, logistics decides the outcome of war. The results of our war game, like many others, clearly show that a war over Taiwan would above all be a battle of logistics. China lacks a large enough fleet of amphibious ships to sustain an invasion of Taiwan. As a result, the PLA must rely heavily on a vast civilian transport fleet. These vessels, however, are unarmored and make for relatively easy targets. The entire US and Allied defensive strategy centers on destroying that transport fleet to starve Chinese beachheads on the island. This makes America's cost of war comparatively low, but only as long as it has enough long-range anti-ship munitions. US submarines play a vital role, but air power is equally decisive. The biggest bottleneck for the US is its limited stock of specialized LRASM missiles, roughly 450 in total. Second, base vulnerability is America's critical weakness. About 90% of US air losses occur on the ground. In the first hours of the conflict, US air bases in Japan and Guam lack sufficient hardened shelters, making them highly vulnerable to Chinese missile strikes. This weakness has been known for years, yet little has been done to fix it. In the past decade, the US has built only 2 hardened aircraft shelters within 1,000 nautical mile radius of Taiwan, far too few to protect its forward deployed assets. Third, Japan is the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Japan's role in the conflict is absolutely crucial. Without it, defending Taiwan would be nearly impossible. Bases like Kadena on Okinawa, just 600 kilometers from Taiwan, allow US aircraft to fly multiple sorties per day. Without them, the Air Force would have to operate from Guam, 2,700 kilometers away. A logistical nightmare. That would also force the US to deploy its aircraft carriers from day one, almost guaranteeing the loss of at least one of them. It is also worth noting that Japanese bases suffer from the same lack of hardened shelters, leaving them highly exposed to Chinese missile strikes. Fourth, Taiwan's geography favors the defender. Our wargame shows that even a successful amphibious landing is only the beginning of the PLA's problems. Taiwan's coastline offers very few beaches suitable for large-scale landings, and the terrain beyond them, rivers, cities and mountains, heavily favors the defender and slows any advance. Despite initial successes, capturing beachheads, ports and airfields, the PLA offensive quickly bogged down. Chinese forces became trapped in brutal urban combat in New Taipei and Taichung. Taiwanese defenders skillfully used the terrain to their advantage, for instance, blowing up bridges over the Tamsui River to create natural defensive lines. Fifth, Taiwan must be fully committed to its defense. It may sound obvious, but it is easy to overlook. Taiwan's survival depends on its determination to fight from day one. The ROC military must wage a relentless defense, constantly harassing PLA beachheads, striking key ports and airfields under Chinese control, and launching local counterattacks whenever possible. Without active and organized resistance on the ground, US strikes on Chinese logistics would have little real effect. Taiwan possesses the resources, terrain and tactics to inflict heavy losses on the PLA, but morale and the will to fight are just as critical. Sixth, the Taiwan conflict could escalate to nuclear war very quickly. Unlike Ukraine, there is no proxy model possible in Taiwan's case. The United States would be directly engaged in combat from the very first days of the war. Beijing understands this, which is why most wargames suggest that the PLA would immediately strike US bases in Japan and Guam at the outset. Such a scenario could easily push both sides beyond rational calculation. Once strikes and counterstrikes begin, the conflict could spiral very rapidly into uncontrolled nuclear escalation. Seventh, the war for Taiwan is a catastrophe without winners. Even in scenarios where Taiwan ultimately survives, it is a Pyrrhic victory, achieved at enormous cost for all sides. The United States and its allies lost dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft and tens of thousands of troops, weakening their global standing for years to come. Taiwan, though it preserves its autonomy, suffers catastrophic economic and infrastructural damage. China, meanwhile, endures devastating losses. Its navy decimated, its amphibious core destroyed, and tens of thousands of soldiers killed or captured, all of which could shake the stability of Communist Party rule. Worse still, a conflict over Taiwan, the world's leading producer of advanced semiconductors, would trigger unprecedented global supply chain disruptions, unleashing an economic crisis of historic scale. 8. For China, an invasion of Taiwan may be too costly. Strategic patience as an alternative? Most wargames end the same way, with a Chinese defeat. Even under the optimistic assumptions used in our scenario, after a month of fighting, China finds itself in a stalemate, with massive losses, especially in its amphibious fleet. A failed invasion could also destabilize China internally, with unpredictable consequences. Beijing likely understands that a full-scale invasion may not be the best way to bring Taiwan under its control. Safer alternatives could include a naval blockade or limited operations against nearby island chains, such as Kinmen or the Pescadores. These limited moves would put Washington in a difficult position, forcing the US to fire the first shot, and not even in direct defense of Taiwan itself. That would be extremely hard to justify to the American public. Perhaps then China's best option is to do what it does best: wait. Historically, China has excelled at strategic patience. In the case of Taiwan, time could work in Beijing's favor. The Trump administration has drifted toward isolationism, viewing many alliances as burdens rather than assets, and seeking to redefine them, including the US relationship with Taiwan. While America remains dependent on Taiwanese semiconductors today, Washington is working to end that reliance by investing in domestic chip production. If that trend continues, future US administrations may begin to reassess the cost-benefit balance of defending Taiwan. Over time, patience could become Beijing's greatest weapon, achieving unification not through invasion, but through persistence and shifting global realities.